Good afternoon, good Wednesday afternoon, everyone. Happy first day of autumn, and welcome to today's presentation, an introduction to plant identification. Today's purpose is to introduce you all to the complexities of what it takes to pursue the practice of plant identification. It's certainly not something that anyone could become an expert in 1 hour's time, but you can become an expert at the very beginnings of plant identification if you stick with us this afternoon, and I hope you all will. My name is James Stevenson. I'm with the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, the Extension Service here in Pinellas County. My background is botany. I grew up in Clearwater, went to Tennessee, Sewanee, the University of the South, Sewanee, Tennessee, where I took to the study of plant science. That opened up the rest of my life, studying plants up in the mixed mesophytic forest in Tennessee. I went to the North Carolina Botanical Garden, from there on to Kew Gardens in London, and then I spent 5 years at the University of Oxford Botanic Garden. So I've had the wonderful opportunity to study plants all around the world. And thankfully, plants are plants, and it doesn't matter where you study them, they're going to behave the same way. Plants are plants. So why did you sign up today? Why are you here today? What is this interest in plant identification? When we get back to presentations in person, this of course is an opening question that I would ask, and inevitably we get the same answers pretty much all the time. We get people want to know if something is edible. They're out in nature and they would love to be able to properly identify a plant because they want to eat it. Other people are particularly interested in plants for butterflies, identifying poisonous plants, dangerous plants, invasive plants. There's a big push for pollinators. Other people love to alter their consciousness with plant substances. There's all kinds of reasons for wanting to properly identify plants, but basically it all boils down to one thing. It satisfies an innate curiosity that we as humans have. Plants are cool, arguably, and we want to study them. We want to know more about them. Well, when we first put this presentation together a few years ago, consensus was that there were about 400,000 different species of plant at that time. Of course, new plants are being discovered, plants are going extinct, it's all kind of in flux, but let's use this 400,000 species of plant as a benchmark. And what we're not going to do is show 400,000 slides and me tell you the name of the plant, and then you're going to remember it, and then you'll be an expert at plant identification. That's not how it works. Plants come from all areas. They've adapted to every environment on Earth. This is the very strange Welwitschia mirabilis in Namibia. This is a conifer that grows out, obviously adapted and solely adapted for living out in the Namib Desert. Of course, plants are also adapted to living in places where nothing should grow, like the iced over extreme northern latitude. So plants are everywhere. They sit still, so that makes them pretty easy to study. Here in our county, we can visit various ecosystems that are named for the plants that are found there, the dominant plants usually being the trees. And we have habitats like the oak hammock. The oak hammock is going to have a certain soil type, a certain soil moisture, exposure to sunlight, and it's going to host a plant community almost unique to the oak hammock. our sister preserve. I'm actually coming from Brooker Creek Preserve today up in Tarpon Springs. We are upland and freshwater wetland. Our sister preserve in St. Petersburg is Weeden Island Preserve, and there you will find estuarine species in the mangrove swamp. So again, soil salinity, exposure is going to host its own plant communities. There's a pine flatwood community named after the dominant pine trees, the cypress swamp. I could go on, but you get the idea. Plants play a role in identifying habitat types, and the presence or absence of particular species are going to dictate the type of habitat that exists, and that's going to play a part in the diversity of animals that might be found there, and so on. So we all get that plants are very important, so being able to tell them apart is quite important. So today we are going to be studying the practice of plant identification. And there's a very good book with no photographs, a few line drawings about how to identify plants. And when we teach this as an advanced class, we provide a copy of this book. We don't make any money off it. It just happens to be, out of all the books that we auditioned, this one is the most concise and consistent in its style. So this is a little real page turner on the technical aspects of identifying plants. So we'll kind of follow the way that this book is laid out in today's presentation. Divided into 3 parts. And I'm going to spend an awful lot of time on this first part about plant classification, because if you choose to move into this practice of plant identification, which I often compare to playing a musical instrument. First you become familiar with the instrument, you learn how to hold it, the name of the parts. You need to kind of get the background before you begin to practice this kind of this study, as it were. So we're going to spend a lot of time on classification, because I personally feel like if you can understand plant classification, it is a huge step forward in making proper plant identifications. And sometimes just figuring out how your unknown specimen is classified, where it fits in the scheme of things, might be enough. You might not necessarily need to know exactly what the species is, but if you can put it in its frame of reference, that is often enough. We'll take a look at the parts of plants, and that's going to introduce us to some more of the vocabulary that's associated with the practice of plant identification. So we'll take a look at some that you already know, some that you're very familiar with, and I'll give you a taste of the language that is associated with plant identification. So again, just like if you're going to practice any sort of music, you're going to need to learn the vocabulary of that practice. You're going to need to learn the language of music, right? So we'll look at the language through the plant parts. And finally, we'll end up with what resources are available. Because of course, no one can cram all of this into their head. There has to be resources. And I'll share with you the 6 or so 3-dimensional resources that I couldn't live without, and a few of the online resources that are available. So that is how we'll finish up. I hope that sounds good. I'm also going to stitch in a few breaks, because after having done these Zoom presentations now going on 2 years, I realized that it's easy for me to get carried away and perhaps run out of words, run out of voice. So I've stitched in some breaks so we can all get up, look away, and digest some of the information because it's going to be coming hard and fast. Part one, plant classification. Oh, and I do want to call attention to your Q and A. There's a little Q and A. It's two speech bubbles stitched together on your little um, uh, thing that you can click, and you can type as a question. And we'll get to those as and when, maybe at a break, maybe here and there. But anyway, please use the Q&A. The chat is what we will use to push any information that we need you to get. Anyway, so let's go. Plant classification. Now, humans classify things. It's just what we do. We put like things with like, and we call that group of like things, we give that group a particular name. So we do it with everything. It doesn't have to be plants. We do this with everything on Earth. We group things and name that group based on similar characteristics. And here's an example of some of the artificial groupings that humans have bestowed on different groups of plants. Trees. Someone might want to study trees. So we have a collection of all the trees based on their morphological characteristics. They have a big, thick trunk made of wood. And vegetables, of course, an economically important group of plants. Weeds, another economically important group of plants. And invasives. Invasive species of plants are incredibly economically important. And flowers, again, economically important because you might buy flowers to put in your around your mailbox. You might spend money on buying flowers. And so you can see that these are legitimate circumscriptions of groups of plants. The vegetable group, the weed group, the invasive group. But I think you could probably also identify these as artificial circumscriptions. One person's flower could very easily be another person's vegetable. And one person's tree could be considered by someone else an invasive species. So these are legitimate but non-scientific groupings of plants. So what we want to do now is show you how scientists classify plants. Once you have your head around that, you can take an unknown specimen and begin the process of eliminating all the things that it isn't and getting down to exactly what it is. So you might be happy to know that there are really only 4 different kinds of plants. They fall into one of only 4 categories. And they're pretty large categories, and they have pretty obvious distinctions amongst them. We have, and we're going from kind of the most simple body structure to the most specialized body structure as we go from left to right on this screen. We start with the mosses. Today's species of mosses, today's modern moss species, represent kind of the very first of the land plants, among the very first of the land plants. They have a very simple structure. They're not highly specialized. They don't have any roots. They have no tissue specialized into roots, no tissue specialized into stem tissue or leaf tissue, and they reproduce in the most ancient of ways by producing these wonderful little individual cells that they can release into the environment. A single cell that's produced by the millions and released into the environment, hoping against hope that one of those cells will then land someplace suitable and then begin to divide and grow and differentiate into a mature moss species that can then go and reproduce again. Adding a little bit more complexity, we have a group of plants that are known as the ferns. And this is a scientific grouping of plants, the ferns. They have morphological characteristics that are all derived from a common ancestor, today expressed as species of modern ferns. These are plants that do have tissues differentiated into real roots, real stems, and real leaves, authentic vascularized leaves, stems, and roots. They still reproduce by spores. They still hang on to that ancient and effective reproduction method. Again, moving up in a little bit more complexity, we have a group of plants that are known as the gymnosperms. Um, these include, of course, the conifers, and you can kind of see how these are more uh, specialized than the ferns. They figured out wood structures, in fact, lignified trunks. They can get to be quite big. The biggest living thing that's ever existed is a tree, is a gymnosperm, in fact. And they've um, streamlined or they've refined the reproductive method away from the kind of haphazard, I hope it lands in a good place, spore reproduction, and concentrated efforts and resources and materials into a propagule that's called a seed that has an embryo inside and some food for that embryo. So no matter where that seed lands, it's going to have a little bit of a head start, not quite as chancy. But those seeds are naked. They're produced on basically the surface of little specialized leaves or specialized branches, and they're just a seed on one of the scales of the cones is what I'm referring to, those little specialized leaves or branches with the seed sitting on top of it, that it just slides off one of those scales of a cone, flies off, and lands. Finally, we have group number 4, the flowering plants. The most specialized, the most highly specialized, the biggest diversity of plants. They have roots, stems, leaves, all that, but they produce the flower. And the flower is even further modified branch tip. Instead of having the special leaves or side branches that hold the naked seeds, this modified branch and leaf system has been modified into this flower structure that really streamlines the process of pollination and fruit development with the seeds on the inside. So the fruit now can facilitate the dispersal of seeds from the parent plant far away, not leaving it up to the wind, but actually placing the seed inside of a fruit that through many different mechanisms is going to get far away from the parent plant. Those are our big 4: the mosses, the ferns, the gymnosperms, and the flowering plants. Big 4. Are you with? Do you think you would be able to recognize a fern or a gymnosperm? Could you recognize a flowering plant, even if the flower is teeny small? And even if if you thought a little bit more about it, you could probably discover some mosses growing here and there in shady and damp places. But the good news is, for our purposes, we can kind of forget about the mosses. It takes a very special person to study moss identification. And the reasons for studying moss identification are not as economically important as the other of these groups. And even if we focus on the ferns, we could spend an hour together and learn all of the wild ferns that you would find growing in Pinellas County. We could do that. It's only a handful of our native fern species. Now, there's 10,000 different ferns all around the world, but we could get our nut around the ferns that are native to Pinellas County in just about an hour. It's not a huge group. The gymnosperms as well. Although there's 1,000 species of the pines and the firs and the cycads and the ginkgos, it's still, in the scheme of things, a relatively small group. So we could knock out the native gymnosperms in 15 minutes and really figure out how we can identify those. So that's a nice, um, conveniently small group of the land plants that you would find growing here in Pinellas County. But the flowering plants, that's where it's at. Because if you look out your window right now, and if you see any plant out there, and if you can rule out moss, because it's more than an inch tall, it's more than half an inch tall, it's certainly not a moss. If you could rule out fern, if you can rule out gymnosperm, it's a flowering plant. The majority of plants outside your window, whether you can picture its flower or not, whether or not you purchased this plant for its flower, it is a flowering plant. And at some point in its life cycle, it does produce these structures, the flowers. The flowering plants of our 400,000 plants on Earth, the flowering plants are 300,000 of them. So really, we're going to talk about identifying flowering plants. So there are 300,000, and we're not going to show 300,000 slides. We're going to break that down even several more times. Flowering plants, there are 400 different families of flowering plants. So of just the flowering plants, there are 400 families. And maybe you've heard of plant families. Maybe you've used that word in a conversation. Oh, that's in the oak family, that's in the fern family, something like that. We're going to, hopefully clearly, but we are going to scientifically identify just what plant family means this afternoon. You already know some plant families. Even if you've been using the word plant families in a way that botanists might not use family, you already know some plant families. And like I was just saying, if you can understand how plants are classified, you can recognize the similarities, and that recognition is going to help you make the eliminations that are important to get to the unknown species that's in your hand. Simple exercise, look out the window. Choose one plant. Start making eliminations. Is it a moss? No. Is it a fern? No. Is it a conifer? No. It must be a flowering plant. So we've eliminated all the others. Then we're going to drill down into what kind of flowering plant is it? And we'll begin making some more eliminations. Now, bear with me, or cat with me. The Felidae is a family of mammals. Get it? I'm sure you do. The Felidae, that's a Latin word because science is written in Latin. The Felidae is a family of living organisms that have a common ancestor. There was a population of creatures that over time led to this body plan that is unique to the Felidae. And that common ancestor then diversified over time and space to become the species that we can recognize today. Plants are the same because these are living, reproducing organisms that have been given time and space to adapt to the environment and the changes within the environment to result in the species that we have today. So here we have the jaguar, the panther, the cheetah, the tiger, the lion, and little Mildred. You can see that these are all in the same family, but they're not the same species, right? What makes a Felidae a member of the Felidae? Is it spots? No. Is it stripes? No. Is it a mane? No. So all these characteristics that might be unique to an individual don't necessarily make it a member of this group. But what does make it a member of the group? How can you recognize all of these as belonging to the Felidae? And what if we had this unknown specimen here, and we had enough in our brain to recognize the familial characteristics of this unknown organism? We could rule out a type of elephant. We could rule out a type of fish. See how it works with animals? It works the same with plants. And after practicing and recognizing, we can recognize that this unknown specimen belongs in the cat family. We've eliminated all other possibilities that it could be, and now we can focus our attention on determining what characteristics this organism has that makes it unique and what gives it its own species, this, in this case, the snow leopard. It works the same way for plants. All you have to do is recognize the morphological characteristics and which morphological characteristics are important to place an unknown specimen into ever smaller groups until you arrive at the only thing that it could be. Sometimes those morphological characteristics are internal, and you have to take your specimen apart to get to the proper identification. That's why I study plants. I don't love taking animals apart. Plants, it's much easier to take apart. We do that every time we eat a salad, don't we? So here we have a plant family. Just like our cat family, these 6 individuals are representatives of a large plant family that's known as the Asteraceae. Remember, the Felidae are the cats. The Asteraceae is this family of flowering plants. Now, is being yellow necessary to be a member of the Asteraceae? No. Is being purple a necessity of being in this family? No. What morphological characteristics are similar across these 6 representatives of a huge flowering plant family? Well, it comes down to those physiological, morphological characteristics that you get to by zooming in and start taking things apart. If we had this unknown specimen, even at a distance, knowing a little bit, we might be able to say this unknown thing looks an awful lot like a member of the Asteraceae or the daisy family or the sunflower family. This looks like a member of that. Let me eliminate all the other flowering plants and concentrate and compare it to other members of just this one flowering plant family. Now, and this happens to be little green eyes, a little native wildflower that flowers for most spring to autumn. It just kind of keeps going. So what are, just as an aside, as a little Plant ID 2.0, what is it that makes the Asteraceae? It's the fact that when you look at a daisy, you're not looking at one flower at all. you're looking at hundreds of tiny little tubular flowers presented on a disc with with separate flowers that are fanned out like the rays of the sun around that disc. So instead of looking at one flower when you're looking at a daisy or a sunflower, you're looking at all these tiny little flowers on the disc. Each one of these represents a little individual tubular flower. So a whole lot of, it's a composite of tiny, 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 itty bitty little flowers. Each one of those flowers capable of being pollinated itself and producing a single fruit associated with that single tiny tubular flower. Here is a sunflower, Helianthus annuus. You can see the tubular flowers sitting on top of what we know as sunflower seeds, which are actually individual little dried fruits, little dried sunflower fruits. And if you crack that fruit open, you get to the seed that's inside. Remember when we talked about the difference between the gymnosperms and the flowering plants? The gymnosperms created the naked seeds that just slide off the scale of the cone, whereas the flowering plants produce a fruit. Whether you agree that it's called a fruit or not, it is, because it's the ripened ovary, and that fruit might be juicy and sweet with the seeds inside, or that fruit might be dry and fluffy like a cotton boll, but that fruit contains the seed and makes sure that that seed gets far away from the parent. So a little bit of Plant ID 2.0, but I wanted to throw that in there right quick. Is everyone all right? People haven't left in great scores, so that's good news. I'd like to remind you, if you would like to put anything in the Q&A, to feel free to do that. But if everyone's feeling good, okay, good. Thank you, Doug. Doug's all right. Good to hear. We'll just go ahead and crash on. Going back a little bit more, we know that there are, well, we don't know, but we can accept that the people who study these things have identified that there are about 400,000 different plants, different species of plants. And the plants exist in what I have identified as the four. Of course, there's others, but this is an introduction. For most intents and purposes, falling into four main groups: the mosses, the ferns, the gymnosperms, and the flowering plants. Most of what you see out there are the flowering plants. So that's what we're going to focus on. If you want to learn fern identification, join us for Fern ID. We can do that in an hour. If you want to learn the conifer ID, you can do that in an hour. So what we're going to look at today is the biggie, the flowering plant identification. Flowering or not, mosses, ferns, gymnosperms, and flowering plants exist within these groups called families. Just like mammals do, and we looked at an example of a mammal family, the cats. All these plants all exist in different families. So what did we see on that slide? You know, there's 100 different families of mosses. Can you believe that you could even tease apart a moss to get to the characteristics that make it comparable to an entire family of cats? So families are groupings with shared morphological characteristics. They're alike enough to represent all the offspring, as it were, all the progeny of a common ancestor that originated those morphological characteristics that are conserved into the members of the family today. Okay, we got some good stuff. Hold on. So of the flowering plants, we know that most of what we see outside are flowering plants. Remember, they're not mosses, they're not ferns, they're not gymnosperms. I mean, if there are, they're easily overlooked. Most everything out there is a flowering plant. So let's make some more eliminations. Let's get closer to identifying each one of those things out there. Well, let's take them one at a time and put them into one of two major groups of flowering plants. So now we're going to take that huge 300,000 and we're going to eliminate by splitting them into one of two groups, the monocots and the eudicots. The monocots are flowering plants that have physiological, morphological characteristics that include the veins in their leaves being parallel to one another, flower parts in threes. So if you can look at a flower and count to three, well, if you can see patterns, I'll put it that way, if you can see patterns of three when you stare at the flower, and if you happen to have a seed of the plant and you plant it and it germinates and it's only got the one seed leaf, that's great too. Monocots. The eudicots, on the other hand, instead of having parallel leaf veins, they have netted leaf veins. And their flower parts are in fours or fives. And when the seed germinates, it has these two seed leaves. So that's a big split within the flowering plants. Is it a monocot? Is it a eudicot? Now this is unique to the flowering plants. We're not even bothering with the mosses, ferns, and gymnosperms. Okay, the rest of this is all about the flowering plants. So there's no monocot, dicot ferns. There's no monocot, dicot moss. That only pertains to the flowering plants because it includes characteristics of the flower, which of course only exists in the flowering plants. That doesn't take any over explanation needed. So they get their name monocots and eudicots. That the COT in the cot name refers to the cotyledon, which is the first leaf that emerges, so that the monocots have a monocotyledon, a single seed leaf, and the dicotyledon, di means two, and so you can see the very first thing that comes out of the seed are these two seed leaves, two cotyledons. That's what gives them their name. It's not used for plant identification, those seed leaves, because it's really hard to identify a seedling that's only a pair of cotyledons. It would be very, very difficult to make that determination. I've put stars next to the characteristics that we mortals can use when trying to determine if our unknown specimen belongs to a monocotyledon group or a eudicot group. The parallel leaf veins versus a network of veins, and the floral parts in threes versus the floral parts in multiples of fours or fives. Those characteristics, which we call characters of an unknown specimen, are going to help us quickly make a big elimination within our flowering plant group. Is it a monocot or is it a eudicot? Okay, you know some monocots. Let's look at some of these monocots. One seed leaf, forget that, but the parallel leaf vein and the flower parts in threes, you know them. You know some families of monocots already. I promise you do. I promise you know some families of monocots. Some families, of course, being a larger circumscription, just like our Felidae, our cats. And then within that, we've got variations on that cat theme. Within the palm family, the Ericaceae, we have variations on the palm theme. Those are called different genera. And then within that, we have the individual species. The bromeliads, I'm sure you've heard of bromeliad. There's a family, Bromeliaceae, a family of flowering plants called the Bromeliaceae, with the variations on the bromeliad theme. The grasses, a big family of flowering plants. Remember, look outside. You see a grass. Is it a moss? No. Is it a fern? No. Is it a gymnosperm? No, it must be a flowering plant. Even though we don't think about grasses as being flowering plants, they are. They fit the description. They bear the reproductive structure known as the flower. The grasses exist in a family called the Poaceae. This one's flowering now, one of our showiest native wild flowers, the Catesby's lily. It's endangered because of habitat loss. And it's a monocot. How do we know it's a monocot? We count to 3. Remember? Multiples of 3. Let's just, because it's big and we can do this from a distance, let's count petals. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Multiples of 3. I'm not making this up. I'm not making this up. This actually happens. We can even count these stamens. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stamens. Hey, multiples of 3. If the shot weren't so bad and I hadn't got the little stigma, you could look down on the top of this thing and the stigma in the center has 3 big lobes. So really, this flower is not hiding the fact that it has flower parts in 3s. It happens to be Catesby lily. It's in a family called the Liliaceae, and the characteristics of the lily family, tulips belong in this family. All the stargazer lilies belong in this family. You can see there are variations on that lily theme. A monocot, flower parts in 3s, parallel leaf veins. Palms aren't known for their flower parts. Palms aren't known for their flowers, but they do flower. They are flowering plants because remember, not moss, not blah, 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 blah. Flowering plants. Saw palmetto in the palm family, the Ericaceae. Have you heard of Areca? Areca palm, Areca, Areca. Each one of these plant families has got a genus that's elevated that lends its name to define that whole family. So Areca is the genus that gets to give its name to all the palms as far as the family goes. But the saw palmetto, Serenoa repens, Serenoa referring to the serration, and repens, repentant, lying down on the ground. Parallel leaf veins are not hard to imagine in a palm frond because they split along those parallel veins into that palmate structure of their big leaves. Here we have a close-up of the saw palmetto inflorescence. And let's just zoom into one of these saw palmetto flowers, and we have 1, 2, 3 petals. Look there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stamens. See, I'm not making this up. It really happens in real life. Another monocot family, the Bromeliaceae. You've heard of bromeliads. Pineapple is a type of bromeliad. Again, not really known for its flowers, but if you happen to catch it at just the right time, you will see that it produces the flowers. And what are the characteristics of monocot flowers? 3s. And you can see 1, 2, 3 petals there. You don't have to go much further with this bromeliad. You've got the flower parts in 3s, the parallel leaf veins, it's doing what it says on the box. The giant air plant is one of our native bromeliads, not in flower, but when it does flower, it produces flowers with hearts and threes. Even if the three petals are tightly squished together, remember, plants can't run away. You can take that flower and pull it apart and count the petals, and it's going to come up to a three or a multiple of three, being in the Bromeliaceae. And Spanish moss, very poorly named. It's a flowering plant. It's a bromeliad. Here are the flowers of Spanish moss. It's related to the pineapple. It's related to the giant air plant. It's related to the Florida air plant. It's a bromeliad. It has the characteristics of the Bromeliaceae, the same way that a tiger has the characteristics of the Felidae, even though it takes a little stretch for you. Once you practice this, you know what you're looking for, you know what to ignore, and what is most important. If you're an unknown specimen, someone's calling it a fish, but you're looking at it and it's got a flower with parts and threes, you can ignore what they're telling you and know what's important. Count the flower parts, know that it's a monocot. I hope that wasn't too off the wall. Moving on to this family, the Poaceae, the grasses. We have this beauty that's going to flower this. Oh, and welcome to the first day of autumn, by the way. We're looking forward to the autumn wildflowers, which we will soon be going out to identify. One of them being lopsided Indian grass. Grass family Poaceae. Flowering plants. Their flowers just challenge us because they don't have they don't have showy petals. They're not attracting pollinators. Do you know how grass facilitates its pollination? It doesn't bother bugs. It doesn't bother with bugs. Grasses, and it's a familial characteristic. It's a family characteristic. Grasses, back to that common ancestor that figured this out and then diversified into all the species that we have today, produces hundreds of tiny little flowers with no petals, no nectar, very cheap to make a whole lot of. Don't have to spend a lot of resources on petals, don't have to spend a lot of resources on nectar. Just throw your pollen out there, throw out a sticky surface to grab that pollen, and send all your pollen out into the air. They're wind pollinated. Foxtail grass, quite beautiful right now, catching the slanting rays of the late season sun. Finger grass, another very distinctive. Those are the flowers sticking up. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of itty bitty tiny little flowers, not making petals, not making nectar, not attracting pollinators, just throwing pollen out into the air and into our noses. Sandspur is a flowering plant. It's a grass. It's a type of grass. It's in the Poaceae. The fruit, the flower produces a fruit. The fruit of the sandspur is that horrible little spiny capsule. That's a fruit. Not all fruit is edible, folks, in botany especially. So what's the dispersal mechanism that the plant is providing its offspring? Poking into you and getting you to take that seed and fruit way over there and then dropping it off where it'll grow. The grass flower, as I mentioned before, is a tiny little thing, it's almost microscopic. It's ridiculous. It's just some stamens and a sticky surface and an ovary, and the ovary's got an egg cell in it, and if some pollen lands on her sticky surface, fertilizes the egg turns into the embryo, the ovary turns into the seed. Next generation. It all happens with the wind. Corn is in the Poaceae, the grass family. And orchids are a monocot family, and orchids are probably familiar to all of us. They have flowers that are put together in a particular way, and they put their pollen in a little lunchbox. They had a common orchid ancestor that had all the familial characteristics all bundled up that it then bestowed on its thousands of progeny that have diversified into the species that we're familiar with today. And here's just some nice photographs of some of our native terrestrial orchids, like the giant orchid, the ladies' tresses orchids, one of our epiphytic orchids, the Florida butterfly orchid. So at this point, um, good heavens, it's already 2:50. At this point, I'd like to mention that identifying plant families makes it possible to take that plant family and just study it for your particular area. You could distill all the species of orchids that are native to Pinellas County as a family. You already know what makes an orchid an orchid. You know that they're in this family. You could then find out what makes them different from one another to get to a proper identification. That's why I think this classification is so important to learn. So enough monocots. Let's zoom through some eudicot representatives. The eudicots, netted leaf veins, flower parts in fours and fives. And here we have some examples. There are more eudicots than monocots out there. And the diversity is, again, much greater. And here you can see a hog plum, a little rock rose. We have one of the Lyonias and a morning glory, variety of shapes and sizes. But we're going to have those characteristics of the netted leaf veins and flower parts in fours and fives. These two look very familiar. They have the same pollination syndrome. They're attracting a pollinator. These flowers are the same size, they're the same color, but on closer inspection, you will find that these are so different that they belong to different families. They're as different as a dog and a cat, right? Because they're put together differently. Although from a distance, you might be fooled because they have some things in common. But knowing what's important to distill is all part of the practice. The rose family, and guess who belongs in the rose family? A rose. Rosa is the genus, the swamp rose. And as we look at other members of the rose family, in a different genus, we have blackberry. But maybe even from the prior slide, you can see how they have some familial similarities, those 5 petals and a whole bunch of stamens on long filaments. And even in the absence of the flower, we could tell that the apple is a member of this. Well, we could tell that the apple is a eudicot because if we slice through the fruit, which is, of course, a derivation of the flower, you can count to 5 inside of an apple because the apple represents a structure that was derived from a flower. You can see the flower parts are in 4s or 5s because there's a 5-pointed star right inside of an apple, telling us, even in the absence of the flower, that we're looking at a eudicot. And we already met the Asteraceae. Aster is a genus, which gives its name to Asteraceae. Aster means star. I think someone's pointed that out. Within that family, we have plants like the Coreopsis. We have honeycomb head. We have the swamp sunflower. Can you see how these are related? You can see the familial characteristics. And here's an aster itself. It used to be in the genus Aster, but because of a very microscopic difference, then all the plants that were formerly called aster in North America have been given a different genus. It's fine. It's okay. I hear moaning and groaning about name changes. It just means we're learning more, and we love to learn more. And we can handle some name changes. I promise we can all handle this. and our little green eyes that we saw before in the Asteraceae. And remember the secret to Asteraceae? All the hundreds of tiny little individual flowers, that we're not looking at one flower here, but each one of these individual flowers is going to need to be pollinated individually. And each one of those flowers is going to derive itself a fruit with a seed inside. All characteristics of this family, the Asteraceae. So let's say we've eliminated everything and we know that our unknown species is Asteraceae. Now what do? Now we need to make some more eliminations. We have to refine our search a little bit further. So within this family, Asteraceae, we have Coreopsis, Helianthus, Berlandiera, and Silphium. See how that just falls out? That comes with practice. But do you need to be yellow to be a member of the Asteraceae? No. These representatives just happen to have these yellow fan-shaped flowers around the perimeter of that very important disc of tiny little flowers. So we get to the species level, we get to the genus and species level after we've decided that our unknown specimen is a flowering plant. It's not moss, blah, blah, blah. We've made the separation between monocot and eudicot. We've got to the family. And now that we're in the family, we need to discern what genus we're in and finally what species, if it's that important. And like I mentioned before, sometimes it's enough to identify your unknown specimen as some kind of monocot. That could be good enough. Sometimes it's enough to know that this is some kind of grass. I don't know, but it's some kind of grass or some kind of palm. That could be good enough. But if you really want to get to know what genus and species it is, you have to be a little bit more sleuthful. And here we have 3 different species of the genus Helianthus. So we're in the sunflower family. We have determined that our specimen is some sort of Helianthus. So now we need to figure out, we're going to compare it to all the Helianthus that are known or that are known to our particular area. And we're going to eliminate all the different Helianthes that it isn't. And we're going to establish a correct ID. Is it Helianthus angustifolia, annua, the normal sunflower, or radula, the stiff sunflower, which does not have any of those fan-shaped ray flowers around the outside? Taking that through our various resources, we can get to the proper ID, is how this works. We eliminate, we recognize and eliminate at the same time until we've made all the eliminations and arrived at a proposed ID for our unknown specimen. And then we check, and then we recheck, depending on how important it is that you know exactly what that is. Everyone okay? I think we're going to have to take a little break. I think we've been doing this close to an hour now. How about, I'm sorry to keep you. I know this was only meant to go on for an hour. Getting carried away. Everyone, please take a quick break. Take 2 minutes. Take 2 minutes to look outside the window, get up, turn around. If you have any questions, you want to put them in the Q&A. I'm going to cut the camera right quick and have a look at the Q&A and be back in about a minute 30. I think we could all use a little off-screen Okay, nice break. I see we did lose a few. That's perfectly understandable. And I hope the rest are good to go for just a little bit more while we round out this introduction to plant identification. So I just kind of scrunched that last little bit about determining your unknown species. We make these eliminations, we get to this thing. Let's back up a little bit and define some of those words that I used. Now, back to the cat family, even though I think by this point, a lot of you, I could use a plant family at this point. I think y'all get it. I'm getting the vibe that y'all are doing good and picking this up. But anyway, we'll use cats just for one more experiment. We've got the jaguar, the panther, the cheetah, the tiger, the lion, and Mildred. Felidae, we can see that these things are all related to each other. They belong in the same family. They have enough in common that puts them in the same family. They have enough that's different that separates them into these individual groups. So here we have the scientific name of the same organisms. We have Panthera onca, puma concolor, Achyonyx jubatus, Panthera tigris, Panthera leo, and Felis catus. Okay, so just like those sunflowers that we just looked at, the Coreopsis leavenworthii, the Helianthus annua, being living things, they have those two names, just like these cats do, Panthera onca, puma concolor, and so on. You notice the first name, the genus name, on some of these organisms are the same. We have Panthera tigris and Panthera leo, same genus. But we also have Panthera onca, same genus. Panthera onca, tigris leo, same genus. You following? Panthera, Panthera, Panthera. These three are more closely related to each other than they are to these. They're in a separate common genus. These are three versions of Panthera. This one is not a version of Panthera, it's its own. It's a puma. It's in the genus Puma because it has characteristics unique to its genus that it doesn't share with Panthera or Achyonyx. Here are the 5 species of Panthera in the world. So these all belong to the same genus. They're versions of Panthera. These are the species of Panthera. Within the Felidae, plants are the same. We did questions. We did a break. Family, genus, species. Part 2, parts, plant parts. So I mentioned very beginning that plant identification is a practice. It's a discipline, plant identification. And I mentioned music before too. So you don't watch a 1 hour or a 1.5 hour webinar and know how to play a guitar perfectly. But you can watch a 1 hour webinar and you can be introduced to the instrument and you can find out that that instrument is actually made up of a whole bunch of parts, each part having a name, that if you really want to do this, if you really want to learn how to play the guitar, you're eventually going to have to learn the names of the parts because they're important, these parts. And each bit of the guitar has a name because you might have to do something with or to that part of this instrument in order to properly play or repair or hold or create the instrument, right? So all these words would be familiar to someone who plays guitar. And I like this example because a couple of these parts like this capstan and fingerboard and tuning pegs, are actually called something else as well. The capstan, also known as the string post, the fingerboard, also known as the fretboard, the tuning pegs, also known as, I hate to say, but the same can be true in the vocabulary of plant identification. Some authors might refer to the same part using one term, and some might use another term. It doesn't make one more correct than the other. It's just we're humans. We have this borrowed language from all over the place. Everybody wants to weigh in. There's regional differences, there's international differences, and so on. Anyway, so if I start hearing whining when people are identifying plants and saying this, somebody calls it the wrong thing, it's not unique to plant identification. I'm just saying. Flowering plants, the biggest group of plants, the biggest group of land plants, the flower itself has got labelable parts that are going to be the same from plant, from flower to flower to flower to flower. Now, how the parts are put together and the characters of the parts once they're assembled are going to help us identify the family, genus, and species. But flowers are made of the same parts. And those words, just like the guitar words, you might see a few that you recognize here. You might recognize the word petal. You might recognize the word stamen. You might recognize ovule and ovary. These are parts of flowers that are, no matter what your flower looks like, it's going to have these parts. And then, like I said, how they're put together, the configuration, the size, the shape, the length, the duration of these parts are going to give us clues as to what larger group this belongs to. It's not just the flower that has part names. Here's a side view of a flower, and we have the same words again: sepal, petal, filament, anther, style, stigma. And then we've got the collective. The petals and sepals collectively are known as the perianth. The anther and the filament together is referred to as the stamen. Stigma, style, and ovary is referred to as the pistil, and so on. Stipule, bud, stem, node, midrib, internode, axial blade leaf, all these things. Now, you don't have to memorize them, thankfully, but I'm just showing you, as I promised I would, what it takes. It takes identifying, eliminating, recognizing, and using your resources, because a collective, the sum of the parts, as it were, are going to lead us to the proper identification. So what resources do we have to identify plants? Well, we've got this horrifying thing called the dichotomous key, which is extremely useful, but it takes an awful lot of practice to use. How do you play a guitar? You practice. Don't give me this is harder than anything else, because it isn't. It's just a matter. You have to want to do it. You have to want to do it. You have to commit to it. And one of the tools that you can use to become a very good plant identifier is the dichotomous key and learning how to use it. Dichotomous, two. Remember dichots? This has the same base of two. You get a yes or no choice. If yes, to the right. If no, down. Here's what a dichotomous key looks like up close. It doesn't have the photograph. I stuck that in there. This is a photograph of the butterfly pea, one of our native wildflowers. Again, very long flowering time. If you ever want to practice on flowering plants, you can take something that you already know what it is and practice with a dichotomous key and see if you can get to the right answer. And the more you do that with something you know what the right answer is, you're gonna, hone your skills of running it through the dichotomous key. Let's say we knew that this was some species of the butterfly pea, and we know what that genus is. So we've gone to the genus page of the dichotomous key, and here's how the whole thing is laid out, but I just zoomed in on this one little thing. We get that yes, no choice, and we are asked by the key, are the leaves one foliate? That means, are the leaves just the one? And is the petiole, what is that? Look it up. Is the petiole conspicuously winged? If yes, head this way, and you've come to the end. You have identified your unknown specimen. That's how the dichotomous key works. If the answer is no, you have to go down, and then hopefully your specimen is not like the above, instead is like this. It's three-foliate, it's got the three leaflets, and the petiole is not winged. Okay, check. Now we're not finished yet. We need to make another choice, and so on. So that's how a dichotomous key works. Full of vocabulary. But thankfully, there are references, so we don't have to learn all those words. We can look them up. There is a false key, which is fully legitimate, just like our false groupings of plants like trees and vegetables and weeds. They're legitimate, they're just not scientific. A false key is arranged by color. What could be easier? You've got a flower, it's blue, you go to the blue section and you just start looking at the pictures. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. Y'all are going to know that it takes that little bit more effort to learn the names of some of the plants, to learn a couple of plant families, to double check yourself, and to be that little bit wiser, that little bit more accurate. It would be very easy to look. Remember the Ludwigia hypericum comparison where I had the two flowers? They're the same size. They have the 4 yellow petals. It could be very easy to use a book like this and find one of the other of those and misidentify the plant in your hand because you were too cursory. Reading the description, using some of the words that as plant identifiers you're going to begin to build. Check the family, see what the familial characteristics are. Do they match with the specimen that's in your hand? You can be much more refined if you take this out a little bit more, seriously. Again, we don't make money on this. This is the Falcon Guide. This is a Florida photographer botanist called Roger Hammer. Very, very thorough. His photographs are amazing. Sometimes they can be a little bit too close up. So all you get is the photograph of the flower. When you need to zoom out a little bit because some of the more the characteristics of the leaves, the characteristic of the stem, the location where it's growing, those could be as important as well. And I used the example of the thoroughwort and the mist flower here. This is a page from the book. You can see these two flowers look a lot alike. But if you look closely, they're in separate genera. So they're not variations on a conoclinum. They're not variations on a chromalema. Despite the fact that they look incredibly alike, they're in separate genera. So it's going to take a little bit more effort and a little bit more morphological characteristics to determine which of the two species we have. So that takes comparing to a little bit more than the color and the shape of the flowers. Just wanted to throw that out there. Here are the sacred texts. For me, here are my sacred texts. I showed you before the How to Identify Plants by Harrington. It's like 150 pages long, something ridiculous like that. It's tiny. Written in the 50s, I believe. Very, very patronizingly written. It's almost painful to read, but he gets all the information in there. Concise, It's got a glossary. Like I said, despite the way he puts things, it's of all the ones that we auditioned, this is the one that we use in our advanced plant identification class. Plant identification and terminology, um, uh, by a husband and wife team with the same surname. This one should be on everyone's bookshelf. Again, all the words that go with plant identification are found in this and what they mean with illustrations that show you in visually. There's a series of volumes of dichotomous keys that are coming out of the University of South Florida. So that's an important elimination as well when you're working on plant identification. Is it found in your state? Or are you comparing it to something that would never be found here? Landscape Plants for Subtropical Climates. This is a good book to check out of the library. It's probably cheap to get used. These are not native plants. These are plants that you're going to find in your landscape, obviously, or in the parking lot at Publix. But this book describes them botanically. It describes the calyx and the corolla. It tells you what family it's in. So again, you can take a known thing and read its botanical description and start using those words that are going to eventually become a part of your everyday life when you become insane like me and do this all the time. Another one of Hammer's books, again, eliminating all the plants from the panhandle and the swamp. Let's just focus on what's native to Central Florida. He's made all those eliminations for us. Thank you, Roger Hammer. Florida wetland plants. This is one that is out of print, which is really sad, but it's a full color wetland, so eliminating everything from the uplands, right? Doing those eliminations for us, and then it's organized by family. I would be remiss not to call attention to the book that my boss and I put together for beginners that takes different organisms and shows how to tell the difference between ones that look an awful lot alike. So we've got aquatic plants, we've got trees, we've got vines, we've got just wildflowers, side by side, looking very similar, how to tell them apart. The same with species of animals, like how do you tell these two snakes apart? How do you tell these two hawks apart? And so on. Anyway, this is available from the IFAS bookstore, Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences bookstore. We personally don't make any cash off of this, but it's something that resulted from a lot of questions that we were answering over and over again. These, is it this or that? So my boss Lara came up with the idea for this or that, and it's available from IFAS Books. An online resource for Florida plants, native and naturalized, even non-native, invasive, all the things that are reproducing themselves in the wild that you would encounter if you were to go and botanize in any public open air place, is the Florida Plant Atlas. Great resource. You can refine your search to your particular county. So you can eliminate anything that's never been seen in your county before and just get a list of everything that's ever been found growing wild in your county. And there you have your own little field guide. Then you can set off to discover all these individual specimens. You can sort by family. Tell me all the things in the Bromeliaceae that live in Florida. This will do that for you as well. Great photographs, great information, keeps up with the name changes and so on. Another online resource is the UNC Herbarium. This one, this is kind of a Plant ID 3.0 resource, I would say. This is a live, living document, so the name changes are updated as we learn more and as we move species into different groups and maybe bring families together that aren't as different as once thought. Anyway, this is the herbarium at UNC. You can have access to this. It's a free document. It's a searchable key. And finally, of all this point, click, and shoot, send your picture, somewhere, we don't go anywhere beyond iNaturalist. iNaturalist is a scientific, crowdsourced citizen science project. It's legitimate, it's legitimized, um, and it allows you to make a guess at what you're photographing, and then the experts come from nowhere and weigh in to support or to um, deny your identification based on where you are and how good the picture is and things like that. So iNaturalist is what we would certainly recommend as an online point click. You send iNaturalist a picture, you have to create yourself, you have to be yourself and all that, and then you upload the picture, you say what it might be. The artificial intelligence will give you suggestions based on the photograph that you send. But then you can send it up to the greater minds who will weigh in based on your photograph. So iNaturalist, definitely worth checking out. For more videos, like you could sit for any longer, we have got lots of these webinars recorded on our YouTube channel, the extension Pinellas County Extension, Pinellas Extension. You can do all kinds of searches on there. Hopefully, eventually, you'll end up at this page where we've put together various playlists on various topics. But you can look, you can spend an hour, you can spend 54 minutes and 46 seconds just on the Pinellas native orchids, eliminating everything else, introduce you to this one particular group, and so on. So I really appreciate the extra attention that you guys have paid today. I apologize for going so far over. I do tend to get excited about the subject. Perhaps that's obvious. We would love now for your input, if you wouldn't mind, just answering these easy peasy questions. Point, click, and then submit when you're done. And our wonderful and talented co-pilot Julia will rein that in, will rein that poll back off your screen as soon as y'all, a high enough percentage of y'all have answered the questions. It really does help us with our program planning. I think, Leanne, I think I answered your question. Who wrote How to Identify Plants? It's Harrington, Harrington. And would it be helpful for our home gardener trying? I think that how to identify plants, if it's a subject that interests you, yes, I think would how to identify plants be of use to someone who's just interested in, not just interested, but is interested in gardening for wildlife? Giving yourself the knowledge will give you the confidence to assert certain things about the plants that are within your sphere of influence. You can become confident that you know what that is and what should happen to it. So I love learning. I hope that's a good answer for you. Thank you for joining us. How do you determine what family an unknown plant is in? Okay, yeah, exactly. If you don't already know, like I showed you some plant families that you already know. You know it's a grass, it's in the Poaceae. You know it's a sunflower, you know it's in the Asteraceae. What about you don't know? That's when this dichotomous key, the scary book with no pictures, that's where they come in handy. Because on page 1 of the dichotomous key, you are asked a series of yes/no questions. That first set of questions is going to be, is it a moss? Is it a fern? Is it a gymnosperm, or is it a flowering plant? And you go from there until you get to family. And then you flip back to page 180. You're now at the Onagraceae family, and you start and you just keep going. That's how you can determine. After that, Jessica, how do you determine? You begin to remember. you begin to realize that you can remember and you can recognize what makes a bean a bean. I recognize that as a legume flower. I don't have to start at page 1 of that dichotomous key. I'm going to go straight to the legumes. When you don't know what characteristic you're looking for each family. Yeah, so good way is to start with that, with the dichotomous key in the very front. And if you can get, if okay, you know it's a monocot dicot, you can even go to the monocot section of that key. I certainly hope that that answers your question, Jessica, because it was an excellent question. All right, I think that's just about enough of that. Appreciate your attention today. I hope you'll join us next time for the next presentation that we have. I don't have my calendar, but do follow us on Facebook. Join us on our, it's Botanical Science for Beginners. That's fun. That is going to be on October 6th. Similar, but different. We're going to back up and decide and figure out what makes a plant in the first place. All right, I'm going to hang it up. Thanks for joining us. I really appreciate your attention. And again, any questions, comments, complaints, or concerns, you can send to my email address there. But with that, I will say good afternoon.